Hi, this video is to make up for students who were absent over May 7th and 8th in 11th grade philosophy at the end of 2017-2018 at Thales Academy, Rolesville. This lecture is intended to introduce students to the life and impact of C.S. Lewis and set up our final philosopher of the year, and his reading will be reading The Abolition of Man from Lewis. This lecture is intended to supplement the Google Slides for the class, so it should be read in conjunction with those, and if there's any discrepancies, please do let me know. With that, I just want to encourage you, as I mentioned in class, that you are welcome to take notes or not. I will provide you with my notes from this lecture as a review aid before we have a test over this material, but if you want to take notes, that's fine. If you want to just kind of sit back and absorb and put it all together, that's fine as well. So, this lecture is all about an answer to our depressing philosopher, Friedrich Nietzsche. We've spent 4 weeks with Nietzsche. We've studied his morality in the genealogy of morals, and really, by the end of that, Nietzsche left us at a point of despair. For Nietzsche, morals aren't real, morals are just a power construct. Everything for Nietzsche, it seems, is a power construct. And really, the goal of philosophy is not to discover what's real or what's true, but rather, the goal of philosophy is to figure out how have we been deceived, and how then can we overthrow these different deceptions. Nietzsche leaves us at this really unfortunate position. As I mentioned in class last week, Nietzsche puts us on the horns of a logical dilemma. If he's right, then really we do have a moral duty to figure out how injustice has been done and try to get rid of that. But if he's wrong, then we need a good response to Nietzsche. And we can't settle for just saying we don't like Nietzsche or Nietzsche makes us upset. We need to figure out why Nietzsche is wrong. The core of Nietzsche's argument that we studied lies in the fact that morals are universally subjective. Every kind of morality that is really just a kind of moral that is imposed by the powerful on the less powerful. Well, our last philosopher of the year is really going to provide the opposite side of the conversation. Writing in the mid-20th century, C.S. Lewis felt that it was philosophically necessary to articulate a universal, accessible form of morality. So, as we read The Abolition of Man, I want you to keep in mind that Lewis, though he's not intentionally trying to write a response to Nietzsche, philosophically, he is providing an opposing viewpoint. So we should view these two in conversation, at least through the accident of our philosophy book having them set side by side. So, in the remainder of this lecture, then I want to first go over the basic biography of Lewis, and then we're going to talk about the significant journey or regression to faith that he undertook in the middle of his life, and then we'll wrap this up by talking about his level of influence and the writings that he had. C.S. Lewis was a man who became really unexpectedly wildly popular in the mid-20th century, and he became one of the most influential people in the 20th century world. And to this day, his writings are read and studied by Christians, non-Christians, children, adults. Lots of people read and love Lewis, and there is certainly a lot for us to appreciate. Well, let's begin with his biography. We should start with his name. He's often referred to as C.S. Lewis. His full name is Clive Staples Lewis, and he really hated his name. At the age of 4, one of his biographers tells us, he pointed to himself and said, "Me is Jackie." And from that point on, he was called by his friends and family Jack. So Jack Lewis was what he went by. Jack Lewis had, in one sense, a great childhood. But he had a younger brother, Warnie. Both of his parents took great care of them both. They lived in Ireland. However, Lewis's childhood was not without tragedy. When he was 9 years old, his mother died. Just a couple years later, his father packed Jack and Warnie off to boarding school, and really he became sort of an absentee father after that. The elder Lewis eventually died, leaving Jack and Warnie to make their own way in the world without parents to support them. So his life is a mixture, and we'll come back to the impact that his mother's death had on him in a few minutes. But one thing we should also mention is that from the beginning of his days, Lewis was bookish. Now, some people, just love to read. Other people, you could not get them to read a book if you paid them to do it. Well, Jack was one of those people who just loved to read. He always had a book. And there's two stories I want to briefly mention. The first is that when Lewis was a child, Beatrix Potters was writing her stories about Peter Cottontail and his friends, and Jack got inspired. So by age 6, he wrote his own set of animal-based stories that really became the beginning of his literary career. Well, at one point, a friend of his father's came and met Jack, and after spending just a few hours with Jack, told Jack's father, "There is only one career for your son, and that is a literary career." So we should take away from that from the earliest days, it was clear that Lewis loved reading, loved stories, and that there was always part of him that enjoyed telling stories and studying stories. And that became a very formative part of his life. Well, he was quite bright. He did reasonably well in school. So after his mother died and he and his brother were at their first boarding school, unfortunately that was not a great experience. Turns out that we've since learned that the headmaster of Lewis's first academy was clinically insane and really made that a very oppressive school environment. But in his second boarding school, Lewis did incredibly well. Well enough that he could see, and some of his teachers could see, that he had prospects to go into an academic career. Unfortunately, as many people discover, it does cost money to go to university unless you can get a scholarship. So Lewis wanted a scholarship. He set his eyes on the classic scholarship, and in order to prepare for that, he took 1 year and he lived with a logic professor named W.P. Kirkpatrick. Now, Kirkpatrick was enormously influential for Lewis. Kirkpatrick was a lifelong student of logic, of literature, of classical languages and literature. He was a very well-educated man, and he was incredibly formative for Lewis, but particularly in terms of logic. This shows up in the Chronicles of Narnia because it's no accident that in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the children in that book stay with Professor Kirk. Professor Kirk is Lewis's mentor, Kirkpatrick, put into the story. An old professor who is focused on his studies and reading and has a house in the countryside with little patience for children, with plenty of patience for children who are willing to have conversation with him. That's the man that Lewis lived with. Now, one of the most important influences that Kirkpatrick had on Lewis was in terms of Lewis's religion. Lewis's religious convictions are going to be a major part of this story, and we'll come back to those here in a moment. For now, it's important to note that Kirkpatrick believed that in order to be logical, the logical conclusion was that God does not exist. And he convinced Lewis of this conviction. By the time Lewis left Kirkpatrick's instruction, he was a convinced, logical, materialist atheist. He believed that only the things that were physically touchable, that were perceivable through the senses, were real. There's nothing beyond that. And that then accepting that is not just a matter of preference, but a matter of rationality itself. Well, the year went by, and Lewis competed for his scholarship, and he received the scholarship. He was off to Oxford. Now, to understand Lewis's life, we need to know just a little bit about how the Oxford education system works. They don't call their degrees bachelor's degrees like we do in the United States. Lewis was studying for a degree, and the way their system works is you study for 3 years, and you sit for the exam for your degree. And you can place in various levels. Lewis took, after 3 years of study, he sat exams in honors moderations, which was Greek and Latin text, and then greats, which was history and philosophy. So essentially, in an American system, this would be the equivalent of double majoring in his bachelor's degree. Well, he took first, or the highest level possible in both of those. It took him 3 years to get there, but Lewis decided he wasn't done. He loved studying and loved Oxford. So he decided he wanted to stay around for 1 more year. And he studied English language and literature. And in 1 year's time, he became so well-versed in those subjects that he sat for the exam and took a first in both of those. So essentially, in what would, in an American system, what would require 8 years of study, Lewis did in 4, and he emerged with the equivalent of 4 bachelor's degrees. Well, as part of that, then, Lewis made such an impression on the Oxford community that they saw in him a young and rising literature scholar. So he became a fellow and then tutor, what we would call a professor in the American system, of Magdalen College in Oxford in 1925. Now, he held that position until 1954. In 1954, Lewis made a career move. He received a fascinating offer from Oxford's competition, Cambridge University. You see, it turns out that Cambridge really wanted Lewis. By 1954, Lewis had become internationally famous for his writing, and they created a brand new professorship position for Lewis. So from 1954 to his death in 1963, he was the professor of medieval and Renaissance English at the University of Cambridge. So Cambridge created a position to steal Lewis away from Oxford. So as a scholar, Lewis was skilled in his study of literature. He was a phenomenal student, and he was gifted in languages. He put the work in. He was fluent in multiple languages at a proficient reading level to read them in the original. In one work of his on his scholarly side, Lewis read through everything in the Bodleian Library that had been written in the 16th century. He then read all the books from the 16th century, 100 years of writing, and then proceeded to write a book about what was written in the 16th century. Now, Lewis was a great scholar, but today we are not talking about Lewis because he was a phenomenal English scholar. Instead, we're talking about Lewis because he had a life-changing conversion from logically materialistic atheism to Christianity and the convictions that there was such a thing as some sort of spiritual, metaphysical realm, and that conviction changed him and it changed his career trajectory, so much so that he became a massively influential, internationally famous author well before the internet made that a more common thing. So, in the next part of this lecture, I want to talk briefly about Lewis's journey of faith. Now, his journey of faith begins with recognizing that he begins life as an atheist. Who doesn't really begin life as an atheist? Born in Ireland and growing up in England, Lewis would have been involved in the culture of state Christianity. England as an organized church, and everyone who was born in England was a member of the Church of England. Lewis, being Irish and then eventually growing up in England, participated in that to some level, but by the time he had arrived at Professor Kirkpatrick's house, he had really abandoned any even semblances of faith practices. And one biographer points to the death of Lewis's mother as a major part of this. And he traces several notable atheists and notices that there is a correlation, not necessarily causal in nature, but a correlation between the death of a parent and someone embracing atheism. As if the response to tragedy is to say that God must not be real because tragedy came about. I think there's some plausibility there. There could be a combination of Lewis's despair at his mother's death, his absent father, and then the influence of Professor Kirkpatrick. But either way, by the time he entered Oxford University, Lewis was a confirmed atheist, so much so and that he really had two different parts of his personality. On the one hand, he had a very dark, realistic, despairing, pessimistic side of his personality, almost a cynicism, we might say. And at the same time, he also was witty as all get out. He had a brilliant mind, and one of his friends wrote in a letter that Lewis is the most riotously funny atheist I know. So we've got these two things going on. Now, one other piece I should mention that one biographer mentioned was formative for Lewis's atheism is a philosophical position or a philosophical problem called the problem of evil. The problem of evil was rather persuasive to Lewis, and it takes the form of a set of propositions and then draws a conclusion. Here's a very superficial level summation of the problem of evil, which we will come back to at the end of the school year if we have time. The problem of evil begins by looking at the fact that God, by definition, is all good. And secondly, God is all-powerful. But then thirdly, the problem of evil looks at the fact that evil exists in the world. With those three propositions, the problem of evil then concludes that there's only one of two options. Either God causes evil because he's all-powerful, or God allows evil to exist. In which case, if God allows evil to exist or causes evil to exist, then God cannot be all good. Or God is not all powerful because he can't stop evil from happening. Either way, then logically, since evil exists, God cannot. Now, Lewis found that argument very persuasive, and there are great responses to that. It is not an unsolvable philosophical problem. And we'll come back to at the end of the year. But for now, it's important to know that that was a persuasive argument for Lewis. Now, Lewis's change towards Christianity began with his encounter of George MacDonald's book Phantastes. George MacDonald was a Scottish pastor and author of fantasy novels and several other novels about the life of a curate in the 1880s. And his novel Phantastes is his exploration into fantasy. Lewis describes the impact that MacDonald had on him, saying that MacDonald baptized his imagination. Here's what Lewis meant by that. Suddenly, while reading MacDonald, Lewis was overcome by how beautiful the world MacDonald was writing was. He was overcome by the depictions of mercy and kindness and goodness and truth and beauty that filled every page of Phantastes. Suddenly, there was as if Lewis was drawn to the imaginary world that MacDonald created. Well, Lewis's encounter with MacDonald turned him into a voracious reader of MacDonald's works. And it coincided with Lewis's encounter with another Englishman, or rather, an encounter with an Englishman's writing, and that's G.K. Chesterton. Gilbert Keith Chesterton is a fascinating figure in 20th century English literary history. Chesterton was an atheist who converted to Roman Catholicism, and he made his career in literature. And Chesterton's writing is distinguished by a profound sense of humor. Chesterton insisted that the world was God's plaything, and it was our duty to laugh at the world, and our lives should be filled with joy and hilarity. Lewis was quite taken with Chesterton's ideas, and all of this kind of came to a head when Lewis really contrasted two different groups of writers. On the one hand, there are writers that Lewis loved, and he appreciated their work. Folks like Spenser in his book, The Faerie Queene, folks like Milton in his book, Paradise Lost, folks like Ben Jonson, and people like George MacDonald, who Lewis looked at and was amazed at their intellectual rigor and the beauty of the literature that they created. The only problem was they're all Christians. They all believe logically impossible things. They believe that God became man, that a virgin gave birth to a child, that a dead man rose from the grave 3 days after being buried. They believe that they will be bodily resurrected one day when Christ returns. All of those things struck Lewis as absolutely absurd. But here's the thing. He really, really liked these people. He liked their attitude, he liked their writing, and he respected their minds. On the other hand, Lewis was well aware of some major figures in 20th century atheism and earlier years. Folks who also contributed to literature, people like Voltaire, people like Edward Gibbon, people like John Stuart Mills, people like Herbert Wells, and people like George Bernard Shaw, some of whom were his own contemporaries. The problem was, Lewis did not like them, and he found these people to not be nearly as intellectually respectable. So, just to keep this clear, Lewis places himself with the atheistic crowd, but it's as if he got to school that day and realized that the people he was hanging out with were way dumber than he was. But he agreed with them on a key conviction. But instead, the kids he wants to hang out with, they're all really interesting, but they all disagree with him. Now, this movement all kind of started to affect Lewis's imagination. And it's a very slow process, but this was how Lewis's conversion began. It started with falling in love with Christian imaginary literature and then coming to understand the respectability of the Christian intellectual tradition. And between 1929 and 1931, Lewis became a believer in Christianity. And by 1929, he embraced theism. He describes it this way. While riding on a bus in Oxford, Lewis had the sense that he was, quote, holding something at bay or shutting something out. He could either open the door or let it stay shut, but to open the door meant the incalculable. He finally submitted himself to God, the most, quote, dejected and reluctant convert in all England. This belief in God happened in 1929, but it was not until 1931 that he surrendered himself to Christ. In 1931, Lewis was baptized as a member of the Church of England. Now, so from that point on, Lewis was thoroughly changed. Now, there's one other piece that I just do want to mention, and there's an additional film clip that I want to attach to this as well that helps illustrate this. One other piece of Lewis's conversion that we can't skip over is his friendship with J.R.R. Tolkien. Tolkien was a long-term friend of Lewis's. He was someone that Lewis very much intellectually respected, and he was somebody who saw the world in a profoundly different way than Lewis did. See, Tolkien believed that myths were echoes of primary reality. Myths were shadows of God's true myth poking into the world. Lewis thought myths were lies. Even though they're beautiful, they're lies. But Tolkien maintained that those myths are true in a certain sense. Tolkien, as a lifelong Roman Catholic, faithfully ministered to Lewis over the course of their long-term friendship, and his friendship was critical to helping Lewis make the move from atheism to Christianity. Now, so Lewis, by 1931, had officially become a Christian. He would live 32 more years after that, and for the last 32 years of his life, Lewis became increasingly more renowned, both locally in England and internationally. So much so that when he died, he was a household name throughout the United States, and really throughout the world. His writings were translated into dozens of languages and spread all across the globe. So, I want to walk you through a list of his most significant writings, and then we'll kind of that'll wrap this lecture up. Now, the first bit of writing I want to mention is a book called Mere Christianity. And we'll spend a moment longer on this one because it is one of Lewis's most important works. Now, Mere Christianity gets its start in the early years of World War II. By 1938, Lewis had been a Christian for 7 years, and he had been applying all of his intellectual rigor to his studies of Christianity. He had become well-read, and he had really tried to figure out all the nuances of his new faith. And by 1938, though, England had entered into World War II. And over the course of 1939 into 1940, the problem with England as a nation was that morale was sinking lower and lower and lower. And it was part of the government's efforts to encourage the morale of the people that led them to discover this Oxford English professor and ask him to do a series of radio lectures. The radio lectures were supposed to convey the fact that Christianity did indeed have intellectual rigor and the ability to encourage people in times of despair. So, just to set that in a bit more context, the BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation, had previously run a series of comedy shows, and they discovered that when your house is literally falling down around you because the Germans have dropped bombs on your roof, somehow slapstick comedy just does not cheer you up. Well, then comes Lewis onto the stage. And Lewis, by this point, begins developing what is going to become his stock in trade and what's going to help him rise to this new level of prominence. What Lewis manages to do is address a nation of people who have a long history of being Christian, but no longer have a clear understanding of what exactly Christianity teaches. Everyone goes to church. Everyone in England is christened or baptized when they're infants, but none of them know who Jesus is or what that has to do with anything. Lewis then comes to the radio, and he speaks in a way that is clear and communicates the truths of Christianity to the people of his day. So because of that, Lewis then communicates in a clear way that establishes that there are spiritual resources to encourage people when the world is falling apart. Now, Lewis had no intention of this becoming a massively popular set of lectures. But the unexpected happened. Just like today, when someone posts something on the internet and it goes viral, you can't really predict what will and will not go viral. Lewis's material in Mere Christianity went viral for his day. It became wildly popular, and it was collected in the volume Mere Christianity. So these are a set of radio lectures that are intending to showcase what's going on with really the connection between Christianity and the resources that it has to bear in the worst of times. Now, the second book that Lewis wrote that became enormously popular is a different kind of book entirely. This is called the Screwtape Letters. In the Screwtape Letters, Lewis sets up the scenario is that there's advice being written from an elder mentor to someone who is young in his trade. So far, pretty normal. Except here's the twist. The elder is a proficient demon who is skilled at tempting. And the youngster is brand new to the demon tempting trade. And he's getting advice from the older demon about how to become a great demon and tempt people. By this point in his life, Lewis firmly believes that demons are real and that they do tempt people to choose bad alternatives to God's good offerings. So Lewis believes that by writing this book, he can better equip people to make wise choices and draw on the resources of their faith in order to defeat demons. Now, it's also worth mentioning that this book caused a bit of a divide between Lewis and Tolkien, because Tolkien thought this book was spiritually dangerous for Lewis to write, because it would require Lewis trying to get into the psyche of a demon, to think like one of God's enemies. And Tolkien thought that was a spiritually foolish and dangerous task to attempt. But Lewis did, and it gave rise to one of the most popular and interesting books that both looks at spiritual advice and a look at human psychology. The next book that Lewis wrote that is worth mentioning is called Surprised by Joy. And this was Lewis's own autobiography, where he describes the way that he came to faith. Now, the final one that I want to mention that is in Lewis's nonfiction writing, before we get to his philosophy and his fiction, is called The Problem of Pain. And this is another one of the places where Lewis addresses people right where they're at. This is a book where Lewis takes his ability to speak to people with clarity, and he addresses the question of why there is pain in the world. Great book, hugely comforting to an awful lot of people as they're going through seasons of suffering. Now, Lewis, of course, is much more famous for his fiction, and I'll just mention two series and one standalone. The first series I'll mention is one I'm sure you've read at least some of, and that is The Chronicles of Narnia. Great series of children's books, and I'll just mention a couple things about them. The first is that they can be read on multiple levels. They can be enjoyed as children's books, but they can also be read as allegorical literary works that are trying to teach some nuances of Christianity. And it's not hard to see the allegory. Aslan is Jesus. The High King and the kings and queens are illustrating a Christian view of monarchy. Narnia is kind of a Christian Anglo-Saxon world. You've even got kind of a medieval play on the Middle East with Calormen in the South and so on. Lewis has an awful lot of fun with it. The last thing I'll mention about it is that there is one scholar, Michael Ward, in his book Planet Narnia, where he argues that each of the 7 volumes of the Chronicles of Narnia aligns with one of the 7 planets in the medieval view of the solar system. And that in doing this, Lewis is suggesting something pretty fascinating, and he actually really makes them into a bit of a medieval study. So, okay, the Chronicles of Narnia propel Lewis into a whole new market of relatability. Mere Christianity and the Screwtape Letters make him wildly popular amongst Christians. Chronicles of Narnia bring him into the mainstream publication in terms of reaching children and parents of children. So now Lewis is reaching whole new levels of audiences. He's being published by publication houses that previously had no interest in his material. These books are starting to make Lewis a sort of household name in the 1950s. Now, the last I'll mention the Space Trilogy as another significant work, and this is one I mentioned in class. If anyone in our class wants to read these over the summer, I'm happy to read them along with folks, and we'll get a group discussion group going over the summer. I think these are Lewis's greatest work. I think this is where Lewis he puts all the things to the side, like where he's worried about clear communication and writing for children. And this is where Lewis kind of sets out to do his best stuff without any holds barred. I love the Space Trilogy, and I'm going to stop there because otherwise I could keep on going. The one standalone I'll mention is called Till We Have Faces, and it's important to know that that's the one Lewis thought was his greatest work of literature. So, all of that to say, hopefully over the past 30 minutes, you've gained a little bit of an awareness that Lewis is a brilliant literary scholar who brings all of his learning to bear in whichever question he's trying to answer, whether he's talking about pain, suffering, how to tell stories to children, how to write stories for adults, how to communicate to popular audiences, whichever. Well, Lewis's biggest contribution to philosophy is called The Abolition of Man. And here, Lewis is going to try to bring forth a universal, accessible morality. And I want to explain those three terms, and then we'll be done with this lecture. Lewis believes that morality must be universal if it's real. It has to be true for everyone in every place at all times. It can't be particular. It's not a moral claim if it's only true in certain circumstances. So that's the part about universal. Secondly, it has to be accessible. People must be able to know what these moral standards are. If they're universal, we ought to be able to find them and understand them. Lastly, then, of course, is the question of morality itself. By this term, Lewis means an awful lot. And as we read The Abolition of Man, we'll get a better understanding of how robust this term is in Lewis's thought. For Lewis, the idea of morality isn't just what's good and what's bad. It's also what's true, what's beautiful, what's good. What is it that we ought to do? How do we find joy and happiness and flourishing as human beings in this world? All of those are questions that Lewis is concerned with, and they are all major concerns that he's going to bring up in The Abolition of Man. So I hope you've enjoyed this introduction, and I look forward to reading The Abolition of Man with you over the next couple of weeks.